Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between John Edwards and Chris Manning.
Last episode, we mentioned that Richmond Group had posted a loss in profits of 67% so far this year. And it turns out the article that we were referencing there was a little misleading, or more so the accountants at Richmond were being a little misleading. And Hodinky was a little clearer when they posted about the numbers. And the 67% is artificially high due to an accounting gain involving their acquisition of Yux and Net-a-Porter in the previous fiscal year. So excluding that, the drop is actually 34%. But still, a third of profits wiped out by the virus is pretty significant.
Yeah, that is sort of a little bit more in line with what I've been hearing from people in the jewelry industry, though. When you consider that basically the first quarter of the year, for almost a third of a year, has basically been wiped out in terms of sales. You know, it's not that far off from what I've been hearing from the jewelry industry. So that's a little bit more in line with the rest of the world, but still significant. It's a lot of money to recover.
I mean, they certainly have plenty of cash on hand, though. So yeah. I think they'll be
they'll
fine.
Probably survive. Yeah.
So things are relaxing up here a little bit where we are in terms of restrictions and lockdowns. So I had a chance to hop over to the studio and see some of what you've been up to. And I can see you have some new toys.
Yeah, there's been a few changes since the last time you were in here, and we've added a few more toys. Some of them we've talked about already. Things like the plasma cutter we've already talked about a little bit, but since we last recorded, I've added some new toys as well. Got a new 3D printer here in the shop. Ended up adding the Formlabs Form 3 printer. People who've been listening for a while, they'll remember I've talked about SLA printing before, and I have actually had an SLA printer in the past from MakeX. It was a Kickstarter project a few years ago that I backed, and it was a reasonable little resin printer, particularly for the price that I paid for it. But it certainly had its limitations. One of them was build volume. One of them was accuracy. But at the time, there really wasn't a lot that was out on the market that I was impressed enough with to sort of pay for without going into an extravagant amount of money. And the Form 3 printer, I guess, was announced March last year, sometime around there. And it certainly looked impressive with the technology they were using. They had this low force stereolithography technique that they're using now, which reduces the forces on the model as it's printing. And that's made a big difference in terms of the print quality. One of the problems with SLA printers is you tend to get a little bit of stretching in certain resins as the model is releasing from the build surface. It tends to sort of pull, and if there's enough surface area there, it can sort of stretch that resin, which isn't entirely cured yet. And so you get a sort of an elongation of the parts as you're printing. And that's, it's not enough that most people are really worried about it, but it is still enough that it was noticeable, particularly in some of my cases where I'm using repetitive patterns that are geometric in shape, or, I've got dimensions that are actually important that need to be there. So it certainly had its limitations. But with the new Form 3, they've done a few things to change that. And there's also a bunch of other little things that make it nice. It's got a heater in the build chamber, so the resin stays at an ideal temperature when it's printing, which is something that I was having problems with as well. The other one didn't have any kind of a heater in it, so if I couldn't print through the winter with it because it was the resin was always getting too cold and whatnot. But yeah, so far I guess I've had it up and running a couple of days now. Managed to do a couple of prints. Got one in there now that I'm curious to see. It's for some watch parts, or watch case parts, I should say, and we'll see how it comes out.
Going with that lug style from Langenzona that we talked about a while back.
Yeah, I think that I will. I still haven't decided if I'm going to do that for the stainless steel versions of them. This works really well in cases that I can cast because I can print a lug that's actually easily cast. For the ones in stainless steel, if I'm going to do that, it'll mean that I need to machine them in that sort of shape. And that starts to present a few additional challenges with the tools that I've got. So I'll take a look and see. It's I haven't had a chance to try milling any of that 316L on my tag mill yet. So once I get that up and running and configured, I'll give it a try and see how they come out. If if they come out reasonably well and I can get the hand finishing sort of at the end down to a reasonable amount, then I'll probably do it, because it certainly makes my life a lot easier when it comes to how I can sort of assemble the case afterwards and keep everything aligned.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it'd be feasible to, say, rough out that H form on the plasma cutter and then weld that to the case band?
Yeah, it's probably not something that the plasma cutter would be ideal for. I think it may be something where I can sort of do some roughing on it and leave a fair bit of material and then mill the last bit. Maybe I'm not sure that it would be worth it though for the extra speed that it would get me. The plasma cutter is great, but it doesn't have really that level of accuracy. Yeah, we'd have to see. I'm going to give it a try. Same thing with roughing out the sort of the circular blanks for the bezels, right? I can sit there and try that and see if I can rough those out on the plasma cutter. I'll still have some material left that a fair bit of material left that I have to turn. And I'll have to see if the ragged edges from it are too much for the lathe to be happy with it. It might be that my tooling really doesn't like the interrupted cuts from the edges. At the same time, it would also be a lot easier than drilling out the center of it and then, turning away all that material that I have to get rid of to get the inside diameter of those bezels.
Now you mentioned the upgrade in build volume going to the Form 3. And I noticed you didn't go with the Form 3L. So what played into that decision?
Well,
the Form 3 versus the Form 3L?
Cost was a significant part of it. Let's see, the Form 3 I think is about $3,500 US. The Form 3L I want to say is somewhere around $10,000. So obviously just from a pure cost point of view, there's a significant difference in cost. On top of that, I don't need to be able to print my own head in terms of in a single shot and be able to cast that. I don't. In fact, I couldn't cast that. I don't have the facilities to cast something that large. So the overall build volume for a single object wasn't important. And even with this thing, I can still print more than enough in a day to keep me busy for weeks in terms of casting it and then finishing the parts and whatnot. So this is probably 4 times the XY build volume of my last printer, and on top of that, it's probably 50% more in the Z-axis. So it's a fair upgrade in terms of the overall build volume.
And the prints you've shown me so far look pretty good.
Yeah.
I wasn't as impressed with the surface finish on the flats, but I mean, certainly compared to something like an FDM printer, SLA is always gonna beat it out. And I imagine once you actually get parts cast and the finish put on them, then all those hints as to the fact that it has been 3D printed will disappear.
Yeah, and when you look at the flats, that's something that can be mitigated through different angles. In terms of the build angle of the model, you can change that up a little bit. And in some cases, I would actually rather have small artifacts in the flat surfaces than in other places, because it's very easy for me to clean up those flat surfaces. In the case of the cufflinks that you were looking at, it's actually based on the pattern that's in my Jaipur pen, and those are ones that I actually fill with yellow. So the surface inconsistencies that you're seeing at the bottom of the pattern, those are not a problem because they're going to be filled with yellow. And the ones that are on the top surface, those are going to be filed anyways as I clean up the top surface of where the yellow is going. So at the end of the day, I don't care about those flat surfaces. So the trick is, with any manufacturing process, there's always going to be some kind of a limitation. There's always going to be some kind of a compromise. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about lasers, CNC equipment, even really fine level stereolithography that they're doing in the watch industry right now for printing. Yeah, Liga. Even if you're dealing with something like that, there are still a number of limitations. There's always going to be something that you have to clean up afterwards. Maybe it's a place to work hold. In this case, it's grow lines in some cases. Also where the supports attached to the model. All of those things are things that you have to deal with, and I have to deal with them everywhere, right? It doesn't really matter what I'm doing. There's always some kind of a limitation. Even when it comes to the straight line engine, I have to be concerned about how I hold that work on the engine so that I don't deform the piece, that I can actually make the cut the entire length of what I need it to, because if I hold it too close, then the cutter gets in the way of the fixture and all that. So, this is just another process that I have to figure out where where to compensate for and what the best way is of using it so that I can clean up the faults that it has as fast as possible. Either, put those faults in a location where it doesn't matter, or in some cases, again, put them on something like a flat surface where I can sit there afterwards with the file, a couple of quick passes with the file, and it's perfectly flat surface again anyways. So, it's just a question of experimenting and seeing what works best and what doesn't. The nice thing is that I'm not printing one-off parts all the time. Anything that I've put on here is going to be something that I print on a regular basis. So I'm going to be able to experiment with it and play with different orientation, different geometry, different supports, see what works best, and then I can just use that going forward.
Mm-hmm. And try and mitigate what little stretch is still evident there in the Form 3.
And when I look at the pattern, in this case, it's a little flower pattern that's on the face of the cufflink. This is something that I've manufactured using a CNC mill as well as with a 3D printer. And in each of those cases, I have had some variance in that pattern. And because it's a symmetrical pattern, it really stands out when something isn't right, when, a detail isn't crisp, a curve isn't the same radius as the matching curve on the other side of the piece. And it becomes obvious. Now, in some cases, it's such a small amount that nobody other than me really notices. But the quality of that flower that's in this piece is as close to perfect as I think I'm ever going to be able to get with it, other than maybe laser engraving it. It is absolutely perfect. You can look and see the geometry is the same on all sides. The radiuses are the same, nice sharp straight edges going down into the cavity. So, things like the ultimate build quality on, let's say, the back of the part, that's far less relevant to me than making sure that the pattern that I actually care about looks great. And in this case, the pattern looks perfect. And that's that's really what's most important.
So given this is a pattern derived from centuries old artifacts and structures, do you happen to know how the original artisans would have executed these patterns where you found them?
These particular patterns came from marble work that was on the walls in the Red Fort in Jaipur. And so they were cutting them. First off, these, I'm rendering this flower. I want to say that it's probably, say, like 14 millimeters in diameter, 13 millimeters in diameter, something like that. They were rendering them in, on a wall. I don't know. They were probably 60, 70 centimeters across. So a huge difference in terms of scale. And then because they were putting them in marble, they had the ability to cut that marble very, very sharp, very sharp detail, and inset it into another piece of marble that was perfectly cut to receive it. So, in the case of what they were doing, these were actually quite large sort of macro details in a fort that has very, very fine detail and very, very fine marble work. So this probably would have been done by, lower quality or lower skilled apprentices, because it's okay, we need that wall decorated, go at it. Here's a border that you can do. It doesn't involve fine detail work. That's within your skill level. So I'm taking that detail and I'm rendering it down to a much smaller level, and also one that you look at in a much finer detail. So, I'm struggling a little bit with getting all of those details absolutely perfect. And in fact, even then I've simplified it from the original. It doesn't quite, the petal sort of flower that's in the center doesn't have the same number of petals on it. There's actually a pip in the middle of the original, and I've taken that out because it just doesn't render well at the scale that I'm using it. But it comes out looking good, even when you reduce it down.
Mm. Yeah, scaling it down, you're also scaling down the tolerances that they had to work with.
Yeah, exactly.
And right by the brand shiny new printer is also your brand shiny new watchmaker's bench. Finally got that up and running.
Yeah, it's not very shiny, but it is brand new.
There is a halo above it. What do you mean it's not shiny? It's just
it's a glow.
A glow, yeah.
A glow to it. Yeah, I was able to get that up and running late last week, I guess. And as I commented on Instagram yesterday, it very quickly became covered in junk. There was a photo of it with nothing on it except for my iPad, And minutes after that photo was taken, it was covered in tools and movements and things like that. So I have already started to move into it. And as you say, there's a halo over it. I installed an LED light over top of it, and I've got a frame system that sort of comes off the back of it. If you remember when we've talked about it before, my new bench is using a standing desk, and so that I can adjust the height of it to exactly where it is that I want to be able to work. And one of the things that concerned me was having light at a constant sort of level, both intensity level and sort of illumination level over my bench. I wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to be changing as I moved the bench up and down. So I've built this frame off the back of it that will move with the bench top, so that light will always stay at a consistent height over the bench, and I don't have to worry about changing the intensity levels as I move it.
Now you mentioned your iPad being on the watchmaker's bench there. Mm-hmm. I see you now have your shiny new. Well, this time I'm being facetious. It is a very dull matte new keyboard case for the brand new iPads.
Yeah, they finally released the keyboard for the new iPads Pro, and I decided to pick one up because I picked up one of the new iPads and I was missing the keyboard that I had. I had one of the bridge keyboards with my last iPad Pro, and it was okay. I wasn't in love with the keyboard itself, wasn't in love with the form factor of it. Apparently the new generation of bridge keyboards are fairly problematic with their trackpad and stuff like that on them. So I wanted to try out something a little bit different. The new one that Apple came out with actually looked pretty good. Their previous generation one didn't really appeal to me. Wasn't really that impressed with it. I tried out a couple of them, and it didn't really strike me as a great keyboard. This one is different. It's we've talked about design compromises in the past, and every design has some kind of a compromise. You have to make decisions about what you're prioritizing over something else. And in this case, they've prioritized certain things. Weight wasn't a priority for them, so the keyboard cover is actually pretty heavy compared to other keyboards. And that's something that you have to decide whether that's actually an important thing for you, and whether that extra weight is too much. It's reasonably adjustable in terms of getting the angle at the screen angle at an angle that's comfortable for you, and it's pretty good. It's not perfect. There are people who've said, "Oh, it would be great if it could open up as much as my MacBook does." Well, it's not a MacBook. It's because of its setup and design, it's not going to be able to open as much as that. For me, the way that I use my iPad, it's pretty good. I'm about as happy with it as I think I could be in terms of the quality of the keyboard, in terms of the ergonomics, the how it opens and things like that. It's been pretty good. The trackpad is great. It'd be nice if it was a bit larger, but again, there are limitations to how large it can be because of the size of the device that it's connecting to. Some people have complained there's no function keys at the top. Well, again, there's a limitation to how large this keyboard can be without, getting into being larger than the device that it's connected to. And so, again, it's not a perfect thing, and there are certainly people out there who it will not be for them. But I've been extremely impressed with it. It's been pretty good so far.
Yeah, the weight to me seems like a necessary part of the design of this particular keyboard, so that it can cantilever the iPad itself up like that. Because if it wasn't that heavy, you very quickly have your iPad toppling over.
I've been using it in bed and stuff like that, and it's lying on your lap in bed, and it doesn't take much for it to tip over backwards. It just needs to be tipped back slightly, and it goes. It's not perfect. They've made reasonable decisions in terms of how they've designed it, and I think if it's something that you look at and you go, hey, that looks appealing to me, it's worth trying out. I don't think there's a better keyboard in terms of tactile feel out there right now. And it has a lot of other benefits. If you're looking for the absolute lightest possible keyboard for traveling with, this certainly isn't it. But at the same time, I think that it's probably a reasonable trade-off. It's certainly not enough extra weight that I'm unwilling to travel with it. That's for sure.
Given the constraints on the actual mouse pad area, the trackpad area, would you, now that you've had a taste of using iPad OS with the mouse input or the trackpad input, would you go so far as to eventually add a mouse to your setup, or a standalone trackpad to your setup?
I would never add a mouse to it, I don't think, but a trackpad maybe. So the funny thing is that this is one of the ideal situations with this is if you want to use it as a docking station. It does have a USB-C port on the side that you can plug into for charging. And when you put the iPad on it, the iPad will just start charging. So I've spoken to a few people who have done that. They have actually set theirs up. It's on a desk and they drop their iPad onto it and they start typing away, and it's perfect for that. And in that sort of a scenario, yeah, maybe I'd add a trackpad to it. I don't use the trackpad a lot. Occasionally for, sort of as a pointer. I find that the lack of height in the trackpad surface means that some things like pinch to zoom, for instance, is awkward. It's expecting your fingers to move a certain amount before the zoom or the reduction in size, before that kicks in. And I find that it's difficult often to get that quite, that right, that sort of the balance of how far do I move my fingers apart while they're still on the trackpad. So there's things like that, which isn't ideal. It is great for doing multi-finger gestures for swiping between apps and things like that. It is actually really useful for that. So I find that I use it probably most for that in terms of swiping back and forth, going up to the home screen, that kind of thing. But as an actual pointer for doing things, I don't find it particularly convenient for that. But I don't think it's the fault of the trackpad. It's just, I prefer my finger, and oftentimes if I want the accuracy that you're probably going to get out of a trackpad, I'm going to go to my pencil anyways. It's going to be better for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard to beat the pencil on the iPad.
Yeah. That is one thing I will say. I wish that there was a better setup for holding the pencil onto the iPad in the case, because the pencil attaches with magnets on the side of the iPad, but it's on the outside of where the case is, and it's very easy to get bumped off. So, if I'm putting it into my backpack, for instance, when I'm coming into the studio, that pencil can get knocked off easily enough. Now it's inside of a pouch in the back of my bag. It's not going to get lost, but it would be nice if there was somewhere, sort of that it was a little bit more protected from, being knocked off. That would be one thing I would ask them to do. But at the same time, it's also not a lot of room in this. And if you start making allowances for that, what else are you compromising on? So, they may have tried different things like that, and they found that the compromise just wasn't worth it.
Earlier, you alluded to removing traces of handiwork from things that you're manufacturing. And recently, Grubel Forzi, in partnership with the Watches TV, released a series of videos showcasing what it takes to actually make a fine timepiece using exclusively hand-driven tools.
They did a really great series of videos talking about how they make the Handmade One, which was, I guess, a project that Grubel Forzi did last year. They decided to make it using entirely traditional techniques. So there was no CNC work being done on it, no Liga printing, no 3D printing, no wire EDM, nothing like that. It was all being done by hand. And it was interesting listening to some of the technicians talking about how much of a shift it was for them to manufacture things that way. And it's sort of funny because I know you're in the same boat as I am, where you're doing most of what you do manually. And even though I have CNC equipment here, I do a lot of manual turning and I do a lot of manual milling. And so it was sort of amusing to me to hear them talking about that. And I'm like, well, that's not a big deal. Like you do that every day, right? And then I'm like, no, if you're a CNC machine operator, you're not machining things by hand. You're not going to be, turning anything, but you're not turning balance staves by hand ever. You're setting up a Swiss lathe for turning hundreds of these balances. And so, yeah, it was interesting listening to them talk about that. And I keep forgetting that my view of the watch industry is very different than a manufacturer, even one as small as Grubel Forzi. They're still producing things at a large enough scale that they cannot turn everything by hand. So, yeah, it was interesting listening to them talk about that.
Yeah, hearing the one technician talk about how they were having difficulty, the fact that certain materials would develop sort of a hard layer on the surface and then soften up on the inside. And so that they went with nickel silver, which has been used for centuries for a good reason, because it is relatively simple to machine, although very susceptible to fingerprints and the like. But yeah, that gave me a little chuckle as well, because that's just not something you are going to be attuned to in any way when you're working with CNC machines.
No, of course not. And you also have the advantage of things like coolant, right? Flood coolant and, ideal tool paths. And you can control things like, down to like chip thinning and acceleration of your of your cutter as you go through curves and high speed machine paths. All of these things that we now know about machining and that help us, especially with micro machining, like as you get down to a smaller and smaller part, the fundamentals of machining actually become significantly more important. Even though it's not a large part and it's not dangerous if something goes wrong with it, because of the percentage of tolerances that you're dealing with now, getting things right in micro machining, getting your feeds and speeds right is very, very important. But that's easy to do on a CNC machine because you can dial it in and you can say, all right, I want to turn this at, let's say 1 millimeter per second. And if that's not quite right, you can say, all right, well, I'm going to try turning it at 1.2 millimeters per second. Well, the average person can't make that adjustment when they're manually cranking a dial on a lathe. That's just not the sort of thing they have the ability to do. Or if they're, let's say, milling out the main plate, like that comment about the nickel silver, they're going to be machining that on a jig borer and they're going to be manually cranking that. Well, they don't necessarily know off the top of their head how deep a cut they should take or how fast they should turn the rotary table so that they get a good chip as they're machining it. There's a feel to machining by hand, and if you're not in that habit, you just don't know it. I get to know my machines well, so I know exactly how much I should be forcing that cutter into the material, how quickly it should be coming off, what the chip looks like when it comes off, all those things. And that's just not something that you're going to be able to do well if you're not used to it.
Mm-hmm. And you'll be able to pick up on when your tool is dulling to the point that you need to sharpen it again as well, just in the way that the chips are forming and whatnot as well, and how responsive the cut is as you're pressing into the material.
Yeah. And one of the things that I look at a lot, it does, it's not so useful on things like brass and nickel silver, but on steel, I look at the color of the chip that's coming off. I look at the color as it comes off of the part, and I also look at the color of it after it's finished cooling in the chip tray. And that can tell me a lot about how I'm machining and whether I'm turning fast enough. One of the problems with machining is that you are generating a huge amount of force, and therefore a huge amount of heat is being built up. And that's one of the reasons why they were getting the, that crusty, that hard layer on stuff, because it was work hardening or it was heat hardening as they were turning some of those materials. And one of the reasons they were probably getting that was because they probably weren't machining aggressively enough. If you get the right feeds and speeds, the chip will come off and it will actually pull heat away from the part. And that's an important part of heat management in machining. So if you're turning something and your chips, let's say your steel chips are coming off and they're silver when they come off, then all of the heat that's building up is building up in the part that you're turning from. If those are coming off and they're blue, then that means that the heat's actually building up in the chip as it's coming off, and it's pulling that heat away from the part. And so you can get a sense of what's going on, and you can see, whether the chip is blue or purple, sort of how much heat you're pulling off of that, and allow for those variances. And then that if it's getting up into like a brown, that you've got too much heat coming off of that, and you actually need to back off a little bit and slow down your cutting speed. So these are all things that you learn as a manual machinist that you won't necessarily learn as you're operating a CNC machine.
And this is exactly the sort of thing that Grupo Forzi is endeavoring to capture through this process of actually going down this path. Years ago, they had teased the Aeon Alliance that Grupo Forzi is a part of, had teased that they would be making a video of what it takes to actually make a watch by hand. And I wonder, in a sense, if this partnership with the Watches TV is the fruition of that, or whether there is still something even more in depth still in store.
I really hope that this is just the teaser to that. I think that this may be the teaser because there was enough footage from the entire process, and I don't think the Watches TV crew were there through the entire build process. So I'm hoping that footage that they captured was part of those videos that they were talking about, and that there's something more in depth and longer. Because as nice as this was, it, for somebody like me, and I'm sure for you,
More
doesn't go
details, please. More details.
anywhere near enough detail. Yeah. So I really hope that this continues and that they have something more detailed than that.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that sentiment. I hope it doesn't sound in any way that we're looking down on or berating in any way. Absolutely not. I look up 100% to Group of 4Z and their crew. And being a CNC operator is it is a craft unto itself.
Oh yeah.
And preventing your machine from eating itself, and making sure that parts aren't flying off or not being machined within tolerances or being damaged while being machined. Like all these things and these factors are stuff that when you're doing things by hand, it's just more innate. You're more in tune with what you're doing. But when you separate yourself, there's a whole other layer of abstraction that you need to be thinking through as a CNC operator. And CNC operators will approach problems in different ways from your more traditional machinists. And there are aspects and strengths to both sides. And I would say I deeply admire anyone who has a good handle on both sides. And going through an exercise like this is going to put these operators in that sort of gamut.
You're right. The skill of being a CNC operator is a whole separate skill set, and it is also extremely impressive. Being able to do that properly, being able to do that well, is certainly a different skill than operating a manual machine, and it is just as challenging as operating a manual machine for sure. It has different challenges, but it's still a very, very highly skilled job. And I find that learning whichever one you are, if you're a manual machinist learning CNC machining or a CNC machinist who's learning manual machining, you're going to learn your craft better by knowing the other side of it. I know a lot of old timers, who will comment on threads on the internet will say, oh, you should learn to be a manual machinist before you become a CNC operator. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that a CNC operator can learn how to become a great machinist without understanding the manual side of things. But at some point or another, there are things that you are going to learn from manual machining that you will never learn from CNC machining. At the same time, being a CNC machinist has made me a better manual machinist as well. I now have a much better understanding of feeds and speeds and depths of cut and things like that than I ever did as a manual machinist, because a lot of manual machinists are lazy and they're just like, oh, well, I've always turned at this speed, and so I'm just going to keep turning at that speed. And you don't really appreciate how much of a difference things like the speed of the material coming past your cutter actually affects things like the quality of the cut, things like the material itself and how much hotter it's getting and whatnot. So all of those things are things that you have to learn as a CNC operator, because you have to dial it in absolutely perfectly. Both skills are certainly complementary, and if you have one skill set, I highly recommend learning the other. It's certainly worthwhile.
Were there any aspects of this series that stood out to you in such a way that you want to incorporate them in your own work processes and the path going forward, crafting your own timepieces?
It's one of those videos that I'll be returning to a bunch of times, because there are enough details in there that it's tough sort of on first or second watching to get all of the information out of it, particularly when there are things that maybe they're not focusing on. So in particular, details about finishing and getting surface textures the way that I want them, stuff like that. I'm starting to form stronger opinions about what textures certain surfaces should look like. So places where certain things should be black polished, certain things should be frosted or textured in some way, whether I like Geneva stripes on certain things or not. They're all things that, the problem is that I like a lot of these things and I like the way that other people have executed them, but you can't put all of them into a watch, right? You have to make a decision. Your main plate, is it going to have Geneva stripes on it? Well, that's great. But if you do that, you can't frost it, right? And that's going to have a very different look than the Geneva stripes. Both look great, but you can't do both on your watch. If you're going to use black polishing, that's great. It looks fabulous. But it also means that all of those steel surfaces that are similar to it are going to need to be black polished. Otherwise, it's going to look weird, right? If you're bluing screws, like we've talked about certain watch movements in the past where some screws have been blued and some haven't been. And I think that that's a detriment to the watch, where you need to make a decision as to what you're going to do with it. And if you're going to blue the screws, that's great. It looks wonderful, looks amazing, but you need to blue the screws. You can't leave some of them as, you can't really leave some of them silver and some of them blued without it looking a little bit odd. So it was certainly, some of the decisions that they were making, some of the things that they were doing, it forced me to think about that a little bit more myself and how I want to deal with that in my own watches. And I'm starting to become more opinionated in it, which I think is important when it comes to designing. You have to be opinionated when it comes to a design.
Mm-hmm. I have more of a problem with the chemical bluing that leaves some blue and some white polish. But I think you can achieve harmony in having both blued and then polished. So you get the white metal revealed again, screws within a movement. And I would say a great point in case would be Dufour's Simplicity, where anywhere where you have the screws set against the nickel silver, they've been polished again so that all the bluing is removed and you get the nice bright white. And then anywhere where he has a brass plate affixed to the movement for, say, the number that the watch is or his own name on the watch itself, those are blued because it serves up a really nice contrast against the brass. Whereas or it might even be gold. Pardon me, I apologize Dufour if those are. I'm pretty sure they are gold as well. Yeah. But the gold on blue has a very nice contrast to it, and I think having blued, if you were to blue all the screws in the movement, you would actually rob that bit of aesthetic from that area of the watch.
And that's a good point, and that's actually another thing that you have to be opinionated on, whether you want to mix colors, whether you want to mix those metal colors of having some gold metal and some white metal. And one of the things that I'm starting to feel is that I'm pushing less and less towards having different colors, different metals like that, whether some of it's going to be gold in color, some of it's going to be white in color. I'm not, I'm pushing away from that. I would much rather have it done differently. I think there's different, obviously this is his design. I'm not gonna argue that Philippe should have done something differently there in his watch. I probably would have distinguished those things in a different way. So instead of having gold and silver colors, I would have probably chosen texture differences between them, to change the look of that. And I would rather see, the blued screws everywhere, because frankly, I think blued screws on nickel silver looks amazing, right? And yes, you're right, it's different than the blued screws on gold, but I would rather, I'd rather sort of keep that harmony there. As I said, having an opinion in your design is important. Everybody is going to have a different opinion, which is great. That's why my watch is not going to look the same as a Grubel Forzi or a Philippe Dufour or a Kari Voutilainen or a Roger Smith, right? Everybody has their own style and they have their own opinions. And, these sorts of videos, watching these people do these things, watching them talk about the decisions they're making and the processes, the decision-making process, it's helping me form my opinions and making me decide the things that will make my watch different. It's the same thing with Roger. Like, I love a lot of the stuff that Roger does, and I also know that I would never, ever do it in my own watch. I think that his designs are intentional. I think that they're great for his watches, and I would never take away from that. But at the same time, I wouldn't use them in my own watches. So, this is where a lot of people get arguing on the internet. And it's like, no, you're wrong. This is the best design ever. It's like, no, it's a great design, but it's Philippe's design, or it's Roger's design, or it's Kari's design. And hopefully mine will be solid enough that somebody will look at it and go, oh, that's Chris's design. And that fits within the design language that he's chosen for his watches.
Yeah, there are areas where you could make objective cases as to whether something is better than another, but in a lot of ways, when it comes down to aesthetics, so much of it is subjective. But in terms of movements that are have a different take on color and finish and whatnot, what did you think of the new Ming piece that was released recently with the way that he reworked the Peugeot 7001?
Yeah, this new watch from Ming, he's gone off and I don't know the process that he's used for darkening this movement.
My guess would be a dark rhodium or black rhodium.
Oh, actually, I just found it here. It's a black chrome plating.
Oh, wow. I've not heard of a chrome plating on a watch before. Yeah, that's an interesting take.
That is surprising. So two things that he's done here. One, he's given it a matte finish, So it looks like it's maybe a light bead blasted finish. And then on top of that, the dark chrome. So it leaves a dark matte finish on the movement plates. And it's meant that all of the wheels stand out quite a bit from the part, as well as the screws. And I like the look of it. Again, it's something that I don't think I would ever do for one of my own watches, but I like the look of it. I like the extreme contrast that he's created here. I dislike the choice of. It looks like he's gone and used a laser to laser engrave his logo on the what's that?
The ratchet wheel.
Yeah, the ratchet wheel. And I don't think that matches quite as well with the matte chrome finish that he's got. I think it can look good, but I don't think it matches up as well in this case as it could. It's almost as if he should have maybe done a matte chrome finish on the wheel and then used the laser to reveal the silver colored steel underneath it or something else. So I don't think that quite matches up as well, but I like the high contrast here. It's not something that I don't think I would use it on a movement, but I like the way that it looks.
And it's a solid caliber that he's chosen as well.
Oh, yeah.
Trusty and reliable. It was a 7001, now owned by ETA. So the ETA 7001. And for any watchmakers out there, if you ever try to replace parts in a Peugeot 7001 with parts from an ETA 7001, you will quickly find that they are not directly interchangeable. I've run into that trouble before.
Speaking of Ming, he and Nicholas Bowman Scarsgill were on the Virtual Time for a Pint a few weeks ago, and that was excellent. It was, in fact, there were a few interesting discussions there about design, because Ming is one of those people. He's spent a lot of time thinking about watch design and thinking about how he wants his watches to look, and he is very opinionated and very intentional about his design, and I respect that about him. Again, they're not necessarily the design choices that I would make, and that's great. I don't want to see everybody else doing the same thing that I would do, and he's made some interesting decisions. For instance, like his dials are very minimalist. You often don't even you have to sort of do a double take to even find his name on the dials sometimes. And so, I like what he's done. I liked the conversation that they were having on that episode. So we'll make sure to put a link to that the YouTube video of that conversation, because there was some really good conversation there about design choices and sort of intentionality in design.
Yeah, his dials are so distinctive. He could actually get away without having his name on there at all.
That was how the conversation originally started, was that there were certain watches where you can take all the branding off of it. Oh, that's what it was. It was Nicholas's new Garrick watch that he had commissioned. And they decided not to put the logo on the front of the watch at all. But you can look at that watch, and it's impossible not to realize who made that watch. The design elements, the hands that are in there, the dial, it is very obvious as to who made that watch. And, there are certain watches that will stand out like that. There are others where you look at it and it's like, okay, this is pretty generic, especially a lot of the dive watches, for instance. I'm not a big dive watch fan. I don't have any need for one, and I don't like the looks of them. But you could take most dive watches and take the branding off of them, and you wouldn't be able to tell one from the other. You wouldn't be able to say, oh, that is, whatever. That's the Rolex version of this, or that's the whatever, right? They're fairly generic.
I think the reason Rolex probably jumps to your mind first there is it seems like almost everything is a derivation of the Rolex Submariner in that particular space.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a huge problem. It's meant that, especially the hands are the thing that I really notice on that. And, everybody's copied it. But it's meant that it doesn't stand out as much in the field, which, I guess good and bad. It's, if you're Rolex, I'm sure it annoys them. Because it means that your watch doesn't stand out as much. But at the same time, they have other watches which are very, very distinct, and people haven't copied as much.
Yeah, what I find interesting about that too is I actually prefer the hands on the Rolex Milsa, the sword hands, as opposed to the Mercedes hands that are more common. And yeah, for whatever reason, those hands have migrated to all manner of different divers watches, in air quotes, because you get watches for $10, $20, $30 that look or basically have that identical aesthetic.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, Ming stuff is great. I love the looks of it, and I have a huge amount of respect for what he's doing, especially the way he's built that brand up over the last couple of years. Again, Nick as well. He's the principal at Fears, and he's opinionated about his design. In his case, a lot of the design that he's using is stuff that he's taken from the back catalog of Fears watches, because he has a brand that's been around since 1844, and so he's able to sort of delve into that design language and use it. Now he's also bringing in some of his own taste and his own design language into the pieces, which is great because you can't entirely stick to watches that are 150 years old. It means that he has a distinct design language, and a lot of his watches, you can take a look at them and know exactly whose watch it is. Just removing all the branding, just because of those elements that he's pulled from their earlier watches.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to catch up yet on that virtual get together for Time for a Pint, so I'm looking forward to hearing more about what Nick and Ming both had to say.
Yeah, and there's another one since then as well. But
yeah, I'm way behind, as you know. I'm actually behind on your YouTube channel as well. So,
dear listener, my co-host is a horrible friend, and he hasn't even caught up on the videos that we've been producing for Low End Design. So we'll put a link for the rest of you who are better friends than John is, and who've actually
got a lot of balls in the air right now. just weave it into my kids' school sessions.
Yeah, exactly. It should be a regular part of that. But having said that, you're not going to be able to miss the episode on the 7th, though.
Oh yeah, why's that?
Well, you're going to be on it.
Oh, okay then. Yeah, you're right. I'm not going to be able to miss the one on June 7th.
Yes, please don't miss that one.
I won't. I'll be there, and I hope to see all of you there as well.
Yeah, we're going to be taking over the Time for a Pint virtual get together. Well, I say taking over. Chris and Matt are still going to be there as well, and they think they're going to be running it, but we are going to be guests on there, and who knows, maybe we'll end up taking it over and turning it into an off hours episode instead.
I think Matt and I are going to be the guests. It's going to be a Chris Mann versus Chris Manning.
Yeah, that is going to be weird. In fact, as we've been sending emails back and forth, it's a bit odd looking at the email chain, and I was trying to find a particular message that Chris sent me, and my brain entirely skipped over every message that he had sent, because my brain just saw Chris Mann and then just skipped down to the next thing. So it is a bit odd dealing with somebody who has nearly an identical name to you.
Yeah, it should be fun though. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, I am too. It's going to be a fun time. I think I've already picked out what my watch is that I'm going to be bringing along and talking about, and maybe we'll if we have time, we'll get into some of the other things we do as well.
We'll keep that secret until the get together.
Although if you're listening to this on the day and date that we publish, we probably jumped the gun by a day as well. So if you're interested, usually the tickets for the Time for Pint virtual get-togethers go out to the world late Wednesday, usually sort of 11 o'clock British summertime is when they've been going out. If you're listening to this on the Tuesday or the Wednesday morning, then those tickets aren't available yet. But there will be tickets available usually for 95 people, I think, to watch. And you'll be able to get those and sign up. They are free tickets. You do have to sign up, but they are free. And when the sign up for that goes up, we'll make sure to tweet about it and to post about it on Instagram and whatnot. So if you're following us in either place, then you'll be able to get a link to that.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. John can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.